I've come all the way from Australia, so I'm just dressed in my rough travel gear. And thank you, Carl, for inviting me to speak to the Friends of the Maple Grove Cemetery this evening. Carl and I actually started a correspondence, it must be about 12, 13 years ago, when he discovered that one of my ancestors is buried here and beneath a very fine tombstone. And Carl discovered it and wanted to find out more, and he tracked me down on the internet, and I was able to give him a lot of information because I had visited Maple Grove about 30 years ago with the express purpose of looking up this grave, which I'd read about in Variety magazine when my ancestor had buried. Okay, so that is the memorial, the tombstone I'm talking about, and that's.
Oh, hold on, perhaps, yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
So that's the tombstone that is sort of the centerpiece of my talk today. My talk will be concentrated a lot on pictures. I know it's my family history, and it's not, the fine detail is not going to be of interest to everybody, but I'll just try and give you a broad picture of what was happening. Hopefully this will enrich some way your understanding of some of the people who may be buried here. So my ancestor was born in a little town, or it was a little town at the time, it's a bigger town today, called Beechworth, Australia. And Beechworth is a position where that arrow is pointing. It's approximately halfway between Sydney and Melbourne. So it's about 300 or 400 miles from Sydney in the north, and from the south it's about 300 or 400 miles from Melbourne. Australia, it's about the size of the continental United States, but the population today, it's only 25 million people, so you could probably fit them all into New York, and we'd all live here happily and comfortably with your wonderful subway system. And Australia, it's about 7,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean from San Francisco. Now, at this time, when my ancestor Alfred was born, 1859, Beechworth was a gold mining town. It was a very prosperous gold mining town. Its population was only about 6,000 people, but it drew people from all over the world, including people from America, who maybe made their fortune or did not make their fortune in the Californian gold rush, so they decided to take the boat across to Australia and see if they could do any better down in Beechworth. Now, a brief family tree. Now, believe it or not, I know I'm just dressed like an ordinary backpacker, but I am descended from royalty. I can go back to William the Conqueror. My immediate ancestor was the guy at the top called Matthew St. Leon, who's my great-great-grandfather. But in recent years, thanks to the arrival of DNA and all these wonderful online resources, I have been able to trace his lineage right back to William the Conqueror, even earlier if necessary. So he does have this royal streak in him, and it sort of came out in his personality because, as I'll explain later, his name is St. Leon. He adopted for the circus a sort of aristocratic sounding name to promote the circus. I'm not going to go into the details of his birth and his upbringing because it's a little bit sordid, but he went through various name changes. He was born in England in 1823 as John Connolly. He was the son of an Irish jockey called Patrick Connolly, and unfortunately he was shunned out of his family and fell into the low life of London, unfortunately, but was unfortunate enough to get nabbed by the police for stealing a coat worth £2, I think it was, and for that he got transported to Australia for 7 years. If you've read the works of Charles Dickens, like Oliver Twist or something, you know that the British legal system, they wanted to clear out all of the the riff-raff of the country and send them off to Australia. Once upon a time they had sent them to the American colonies, but Britain lost the American colonies, so they had to discover a new place to send their convicts, and that was Australia. So Matthew St, my great-great-grandfather. Now, as I said, when he was arrested, he gave his name, although he was born Connolly, John Connolly. When he came before the court, he'd already been arrested and put in jail about 2 or 3 years earlier for a very minor offence. And he only received 10 days imprisonment for that. And he knew that if he was convicted again, well, that would be the ticket to Australia. So he didn't give the court his name, John Connolly. He gave his name as John Jones, just about the most prosaic name you could think of. But unfortunately, the policeman who arrested him 3 years earlier was in the court, and he spoke up to the judge and said, "This is not John Connolly. This is not John Jones. This is John Connolly." But his name had already been entered in the record as John Jones, so it stuck. And so he was sent to Australia as John Jones, and he went under that name for a few years, but eventually adopted a more colourful name, St Leon, as I'll explain a bit later. Okay, so that's Matthew St Leon. Now that's probably at the height of his fame in Australia in 1882, when he was conducting his own circus, at that time probably Australia's leading circus. And the first, he had started his circus career in Australia in 1847. Although he was sentenced to, transported in London in 1842 and received a sentence of 7 years, he was quite a good convict, as convicts go. I've seen his convict record. He hardly did anything bad, apart from maybe going to sleep at one night while supposedly serving as a watchman. But he was quite a good convict, so he got what's called a ticket of leave, which is kind of a parole after about 3 or 4 years. Now, he had no skills except that his jockey father had taught him to ride very capably, and also in the streets of London he used to perform in the streets as a street acrobat. So the idea was this was the only thing he could turn his mind to, unless he went back to maybe digging roads or things like that. So with another guy in Launceston, Tasmania, a guy called Robert Radford, they established a circus in 1847 in Launceston, which is on the northern tip of Tasmania. And for all intents and purposes, that was Australia's first circus. It wasn't a circus in a tent, but a circus in a kind of a pavilion, maybe timber sides and maybe a canvas roof. And after a few years down there, he came to the mainland as the first gold rushes were breaking out. And at a town called Safala, which is about 200 miles or so west of Sydney, he formed his first circus under a tent. And that circus he called Jones's Circus, or Jones's National Circus. And for the next 15 years he travelled the eastern colonies of Australia. Now, Australia's population at this time was at the most about 500,000 people. It had only been settled with the first arrival of convicts in 1788. So things were just heating up with the gold rushes, and also my great-great-grandfather in Tasmania here had married a young Irish girl, and together over the years they had 9 children, and 3 of the boys in the family, they followed their father into the circus. They were trained in the circus from infancy. Training of circus it wouldn't be tolerated today. There'd be laws against it, but in those days there were no laws, child protection laws, certainly in Australia, that might have been here. So circus families just trained their children from a very young age to juggle, to do acrobatics, to ride horses and so on. Now, So he conducted Jones's circus for about 14 years, from 1851 to 1864. But I think he eventually came to the conclusion that Jones's circus was not such a attractive name for a circus. He had to think up a more fancy name for the circus. Just the same as I suppose Norma Jean Baker had to think up a more suitable name for her film career, so she called herself Marilyn Monroe, or somebody called Marilyn Monroe. So it happens in show business, this adoption of names to make people sound that they come from some exotic place to entice the people to come along. So the name he settled on was the name St. Leon, and over time it just became the accepted family name, so that that's what I am. I'm Mark St. Leon, and I can say until the age of 17 I had no idea about what, this is all the result of my research. I just accepted this great family story that somewhere we come from France, and there's castles and aristocrats we're descended from. In fact, we come from Australia's oldest circus family, originally called Jones, and along the line they decided to invent a more fancy name for the circus. Okay, so a very summary family tree. So my great-great-grandfather, and here, as I said, he had 3 sons, Gus, Walter and Alfred, who followed him into the circus. These guys all became circus performers themselves, and in due course also became circus proprietors. The main family line was the Gus St. Leon line, but I won't be talking about them tonight. But many of Gus's family did come to America and had successful careers here. My line, the middle line, was from the second son, Walter, who had a son, Norman, who I remember, he was a manager of Bullen's Circus in Australia, a very large circus, but he died when I was 11. And then my father, and by this time we were beginning to move out of the circus because my father disdained his circus past. He became an airline pilot instead. And then me down here, I became a university lecturer, so we gradually moved out of the circus. But I had the curiosity that my father didn't have to find out where the family came from. So I've spent many years, in fact decades, untangling it all and finding out how it all fits together. But the person I'll be talking about tonight is the third son, Alfred, born in Beechworth, 1859. And he died rather early in life, in 1909, aged only 50. So it'll be the family of Alfred I'm talking about, and these would be people who today would be second, third cousins to what I am.
Can you hold the mic closer to you?
Yeah, sure. Is that better?
Yes.
Sorry. Oh, I don't get much practice doing this. Okay, so there's just a few words on Beechworth, Victoria, and oh, sorry. Where are we?
Go back.
One back.
Yes.
No, that's forward.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So we know that Alfred was born in Beechworth in March 1859 because Jones's circus turned up in the town. There's some reviews of the circus. And there's also a little notice in the newspaper that at Beechworth yesterday morning, the wife of Mr. John Jones, proprietor of the National Circus, gave birth to a son. So we have it there in print, although his birth was never registered in the formal sense. And that's important to recognise because when you see the tombstone, I'll show you the close-up again in a little while, it says that he was born in Beechworth, but in 1861. So there's a little mistake on the tombstone. It's not going to matter now, but the record shows that in fact he was 2 years older than what the tombstone says. Okay, so as I said, the 3 sons were brought up in the circus, Gus, Walter and Alfred. They were trained from infancy to become bareback riders, acrobats, gymnasts, and they turned out to be very good performers. And to get experience, for a while they worked in other established circuses to get the feel of the circus business before they went back and reformed their own circus. And this photograph was taken in 1874. There's Alfred, the guy I'm speaking about today. He's only a youth of about 15 there. And this guy here is my great-grandfather, Walter, who's he's about 18 or 19 there. And as you can see, there's a striking resemblance between Walter and myself.
Yeah.
That's a joke.
It's just the hair.
Just the hair, yeah. Well, he lost his hair eventually. That's the way it turned out. So, and these two guys, these were, I think this guy was a bandsman, this guy was a clown or something like that. Okay, so they got experience with other circuses. Now, what did an Australian circus look like at this time? This would be the typical circus, live circus you'd see in Australia at that time. A two-pole tent. It's going to be travelled by horses and wagons because in Australia at that time, very few railways. The roads were shocking. In fact, you call them tracks, you wouldn't call them roads. And circus in those days travelled with horse and wagons. The most you could travel would be maybe 15, 20 miles a day. Now, Australia by this time, the 1870s, the population had grown, probably reached, not sure, maybe about 2 million people, because there'd been a large influx of immigrants with the gold rushes, opening up the interior lands, and of course natural increase in the births in the population. Now compare that with a large American circus that visited Australia not long after. This photograph is taken in Melbourne in 1877. You see all these tents here. These are the tents of Cooper, Bailey and Company's circus, which at the time was America's largest circus. And you can see by the name Bailey, it's the ancestral circus of the famous Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. So as you can see, an American circus was a whole lot bigger than a colonial Australian circus. So Alfred, he developed a wide range of skills: bareback rider, acrobat, gymnast, and also he was a singer and could dance as well. So he's quite a versatile chap. But his main focus of attention in his circus career was as a bareback rider. And this photograph was taken in a town called Tamworth in New South Wales, 1878. He's aged there about 19, and that's the typical kind of dress that male circus riders would wear in those days. A little skirt here, he'd undo that just to leave some, I don't know what, almost like little pants or something, and the highlight of his act would be to turn somersaults on his horse as it went around the ring. But all the accounts, the reviews, the critiques in the newspapers are very flattering of his performances, which were a novelty for the time, because before this, circus riders didn't do so much acrobatics on horseback. They did posing, and they acted out stories on horseback. But by this time, the idea of combining acrobatics and horsemanship was combined into the one art, and that's what Alfred seems to have concentrated on. Now, 1882, Alfred there on the left, he proposed marriage to another circus rider, a lady in a rival circus called Vernon Ida Cousins. They were married in Melbourne in 1882. Now, at this time, St Leon's Circus is probably the leading circus in Australia, and Ida worked in her parents' circus, which was called Woodyear's Circus, which was perhaps the second or third best known circus in Australia. The name Vernon Ida, she was born on the ship that brought she and her family to Australia, and the convention in those days is if somebody was born on a ship, they named them after the ship. And the ship she was brought on was the SS Vernon. So that was incorporated into her name, Vernon Ida Cousins. But when she performed before the public, she'd just take those two names there, Vernon and Ida, and turn them back to front and call herself Ida Vernon. So, yeah. So in the advertising for the circus and the critiques, etc., she's always written up as Ida Vernon. And Ida Vernon's, her mother was a very famous bareback rider as well. So you can see the lineage. This is the idea in circus families. To make a strong circus family is a good idea. Circus boy and circus girl married each other, and then they could produce circus-type children, and they could train them in circus work from a young age. So that's in Melbourne in 1882, and they brought forth 7 children altogether. I've just listed them here: Golda, Elsie, Myrtle, George, Ida, Vera and Roy. And the ones I've put in red, those are the ones that actually pursued circus careers of their own. The others I'll talk about later on, but the ones in red, and I'll show you pictures of them later on, were the ones who actually became circus performers themselves. And to give you an idea of how the circus travelled, Golda was born in Brisbane, Elsie born in Sydney, Myrtle born in Melbourne, George born in Sydney, Ida born in a little town called Borawa, about 200 miles away from Sydney. Vera was born in China, and Roy was born in Spokane, Washington. So that gives you an idea of the travelling and producing the kids of the circus as they went. Now, the St Leon's Circus had its highlight years, say from about 1875 till about 1889, and then other circuses started to come up in competition. And St Leon's Circus sort of went down a peg or two as the leading circus in Australia. And in addition to that, in about 1893, Australia was struck by a large economic recession, and it was very hard for show business in particular. So many circus people left Australia to see if they could find work and opportunities overseas. So some went to South Africa, some went to America, and Alfred and his family, young family, they decided to go with a circus and tour at first Southeast Asia and China, Indochina, Japan, without really much idea of where they wanted to go eventually. They thought eventually they'd come back to Australia, but instead they kept going from one place to another. And eventually they ended up in Vancouver, Canada, and from there they decided to enter the United States and see what the United States had to offer. And that was about the year 1899 when they entered the United States, and they started getting work as acrobats. They could get work not only in circus but also in vaudeville, because vaudeville also presented circus-type acts on the stage. So they had this little card printed. There's Alfred, his wife, Ida Vernon, their eldest daughter who went into the circus, Elsie, then George, and then little Ida. But they found opportunities in America, well, as it still is, it's kind of the mecca of international show business, and they kept getting engagement after engagement. So they never got back to Australia. Instead, they kept climbing through the ranks of American show business. And by 1902, they're being presented as the 5 famous St Leons. There's Alfred again, his wife Ida, their elder daughter Elsie, George and little Ida. And in 1905 they had a engagement with the William P. Hall shows. This is a large circus which was organised in Missouri, and they're presented there. This is a photograph of a circus poster that was pasted on billboards and sidewalls, and they're presented there as the 5 St. Leon's, America's premier acrobats. No talk that they come from Australia, no talk that once upon a time they were the Jones family. They're just the 5 St. Leons. And just as a sideline, I was doing some research at the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin last week, and only just by chance came across this letter that Alfred had written to William P. Hall on the family letterhead, saying we're presently working in Toledo. We hope to join you for the coming season. We'll get there a few weeks earlier so we can get accustomed to the horses and start working with your circus. By 1908, their rise to the show business continued, and this photograph is taken in New York. And they're now the famous St. Leon family. And there's Alfred in the middle, his wife, his daughters, there's George and little Ida at the back. And at this time, they became friendly with a guy called Frederick Thompson, who was the founder of Coney Island, the great New York amusement resort. And in addition to developing Coney Island, Frederick Thompson also had a few sidelines, and one of which was to tour this stage production of Polly of the Circus. It was based on a book written by a lady called Margaret Mayer, and it was transformed into a stage production. But the stage production also had live circus scenes on the stage. And the family, Alfred's family, they were engaged to perform these live circus scenes. They only went for about 45 seconds during the entirety of the production. And they toured around the United States and Canada doing this. And this is the cover of the music that was composed for Polly of the Circus. And that's the way the family would appear on the stage when they did their realistic circus performance, to give the story a picture of reality. A close-up there, and that's what they did. Now, the lady who was the star of Polly of the Circus was a lady called Mabel. It looks as though it's spelled Taliaferro, but my understanding it's pronounced Tolliver. Anyway, however it's pronounced, she was the initial star of Polly of the Circus. She had the title role of Polly, which she did for about 2 years. Now, while she was acting as Polly, little Ida, Alfred's daughter, would wait in the wings and would observe her very closely. And every night she'd just study this actor's her words that spoken on the stage and all her gestures and so on. And when Mabel Tolliver decided to move on to other work after about 2 years, little Ida, who by then was about 16, knew the parts perfectly. Not only that, but she could do acrobatics, which Mabel couldn't do, because Mabel wasn't a circus performer, she was just a regular actress. So they decided to appoint little Ida as the next Polly of the Circus, and that's the way she was dressed. That's in her traditional circus attire. She's of age about 16 or 17. But unfortunately, also at this time is when Alfred St. Leon died. He died of what we now know as tuberculosis. I think in those days it was called consumption. He was spent the last few months of his life at a sanitarium in Rutland, Massachusetts, and died in February 1909, and left a wife and 7 children. But as you can see by the monument that was erected over his grave, he must have been dearly loved and dearly missed. And the passing of Alfred St was reported in the show business magazines of the day, and there was also a picture of the gravestone that had been erected over his tomb, over his grave, which I discovered going through old issues of Variety, which I came here in 1985 and located the tombstone for myself. So that's the tombstone under which Alfred was buried, and I don't know much about tombstones, but I would say that this is a rather elaborate one, and I would imagine rather expensive. So Polly, getting back to the family, Ida takes over as Polly, and her fame starts to rise, and now she's shown here in 1913 on the front page of Billboard, America's show business magazine. Now, the family continued working in Polly the Circus, doing these live circus performances on the stage, I think during the American autumn and spring. But in the summer, they would go back to Coney Island and work at Luna Park, which was an area of Coney Island which had, I think, it had an outdoor circus, we know that, and sideshows. So the summer months they would spend working in Luna Park and doing their conventional circus acts there. So the elder circus daughter, Elsie May, did her bareback riding act. And at this time she was regarded as one of America's leading lady bareback riders. And in this shot here, she's actually doing a somersault on the back of a horse. Not too many riders, male or female, could do tricks like this, so it was quite an accomplishment. And it's a bit hard to make out, but Elsie's brother George, you can just see there, is standing on the back of a horse, and that there is a circus ring. It's above a lake or a little canal or something there, but that was Luna Park. That was the outdoor circus on Coney Island. Little Ida, she after Polly the Circus, she'd come back and she'd work also at Luna Park. And there she is on her horse as it's travelling around the circus ring there at Luna Park. Ida also walked the wire, and here she is with her brother. Again, it's very small, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a tight wire along there, and there's Ida, there's her brother George, and it looks as though they're doing some sort of a dance or something across the tight wire. Little Ida and her older sister Elsie, they would do a double bareback riding act, two girls on the one horse, and this photograph was published in the show business magazine Variety. Ida's older sister Elsie, she'd dress up in these fancy costumes and also entertain the audience. So the fame of the family continued to escalate. In 1910, you can see George and Elsie. These are the children of Alfred, and they're featured on the front cover of Billboard magazine. That's August 1910. So that was the kind of legacy that Alfred died. He died rather young. He was only 50 when he died of tuberculosis. But he left this family of quite polished, quite talented performers. And even after his death, they continued performing. So just to wrap things up, what I'll just explain is what happened to these children that he left behind. Did they continue in circus, or did they do something else? Now, like I said, not all of his children went into circus. The eldest daughter had a career as a nurse. Her name was Golda, and I don't know, maybe she didn't like circus performing, or she wasn't skilled enough or something. But anyway, she graduated as a nurse from the Grace Hospital in Detroit, which is, I understand, is quite a prestigious hospital there. She had quite an eminent career there as a senior nurse. Unfortunately, she died rather young in 1939, aged 57. Elsie, the one you saw turning the somersault on the horse, she eventually moved out of circus work, but she did marry a vaudeville performer, and they would perform little vaudeville acts for a while, but then eventually retired out to California. And Elsie had a long life. She only passed away in 1976, at the age of 92. And had I known, I would have loved to have spoken to her, but the problem down there in Australia, particularly in those days, without the internet or things like that, and the name changes with people, with particularly women marrying, it makes it very difficult to track people down, at least in those days.
76.
The son, George, he had a career as a circus ringmaster and rider, but unfortunately he suffered a riding accident and was left crippled. So that finished his active performing career. But he had married another circus lady who was a rider, and he managed her act. His wife was this lady Lillian, and they formed the St. Leon troupe of bareback riders. As you can see, Lillian features America's premier equestrian, and the St. Leon troupe continued performing in circus up until the late 1930s. Then George and Lillian, they retired from circus. They opened a photographic studio in Detroit, and then George was encouraged to move out to California for a warmer climate and for his health, but unfortunately by the end of his life he was in a wheelchair, and he died in Los Angeles in 1955. Little Ida, the one who made the transformation from circus work to acting, she continued. After Polly the Circus, she moved on to other acting roles in American theatre, and in 1917 she was actually voted one of the 10 most admired actresses in American theatre. But Ida decided to get married, and she married a Los Angeles businessman, and she retired from show business, although I did interview her son some years ago, and he told me that she continued with an amateur acting group in Los Angeles called the Thespians, and at one time the famous Debbie Reynolds was a member of the Thespians. And the youngest daughter, who I haven't showed you before, this is really the only picture we have of her. This was the one born in China, Vera. But she also left the circus. We don't know much about her, and she died rather young in New York in 1947. There was a second son called Roy. I have no photograph of him. As far as I can see, he didn't go off with the circus, but he did serve with the United States Marines in World War I. And after that he became an executive in the Armour Meat Corporation in Chicago. And eventually he retired out to California. He died in Palm Springs in 1971. So that brings us back to the tombstone for Alfred St. Leon. For whatever reason, there was also room in this plot to bury two of the daughters, Golda and Vera. So they're buried with their father. And this little tombstone records that. But that was the only, everyone else in the family was buried, I think, mostly in California or somewhere else. So that's really all that I have to say, but anytime any of you would like to contact me, my details are there, or Carl can pass them on to you. I have my own website, www.pennygaff.com, and you'll be able to read a lot of the history that I have uncovered, and also see lots of videos and photographs.
That's a good idea.
So I'm happy to answer any questions or that you might have, or clarifications you might require.
What happened to his wife? He's buried here. What about his wife?
His wife, she joined her daughter Ida, the one that married the Los Angeles businessman, and she settled out in Los Angeles. She died in 1935. She's buried in the big cemetery there. I forget its name. Outside Los Angeles, anyway.
Fascinating story and beautiful people.
Yeah, they were. Well, they had a handsome mum and dad, I think, and that's and they were doing all very healthy exercise. So
Yes.
they.
Fascinating. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.
I have a question. Were there any photos that were passed down, or did you really have to find all of this through your research?
Well, I have to find it through my research.
Yeah.
I can quite. I told you as I was growing up, I was just kept in the dark about the family. I knew they'd been in the circus, but I couldn't have written more than about half a page when I was about 17, and that's what sparked my curiosity. But one of the I knew that I had a great grandfather, Walter. He had a brother, Gus, but I never knew there was this other brother that went to America. And in Australia, 50 years ago, we didn't have the internet to look these things up, and you had to write letters here, there, and everywhere. It was so messy. But eventually, I did sort of crack the combination, and I found that this one. I'll just go back a bit. Elsie, the one here, her married name was Powers, but I found that she had died in San Bernardino, California, in 1976. So I got her death certificate, and that showed me the name of the informant. And from that, I contacted the informant's son, because the informant had died, but the son was all up. And they wrote back and say, yes, she's left a whole box of stuff here. You're welcome to it. So, only 2 or 3 months. We'll send it to you when the holidays are over. I had to wait 2 or 3
months. Lived the longest. So
couldn't you send it couldn't you send it next week?
Yeah.
So a great box of beautiful photographs came back, and documents and so on. So I added that, and then then George, as I said, his wife Lillian, she lived to quite a great age too. She died in 1986, also in Los Angeles. And I did locate her address because she'd married St. Leon. I did find her listed in the Los Angeles telephone book, because in Sydney, in Australia, in those days, you could go to this great office of Telecom, the Telecommunications Authority, and they had telephone books for just about every city and country in the world, including the United States. So I went through one American telephone book after looking for St. Leon, and eventually got to Los Angeles, and I found an LG St. Leon, which is her initials. And I wrote, but I never received a reply. But some years later, I did a search of Californian death records, and I found that Lillian Gertrude St. Leon had died in 1986. But again, the name of the informant, and I contacted her. She was still living, and she'd spent a lot of time with Lillian in her final days, and sent me another great treasure trove of photographs. And also, I eventually did meet up with her on my next visit to the United States, and she gave me a lot of information that way. So, I've been able to piece together a lot of what might otherwise have been lost. Yes?
Was he buried here because the family was working at Coney Island?
Yeah, I think I get the impression that New York was sort of the, even though they were travelling all over the United States and Canada, they even went down to Cuba at one stage. But New York seemed to be the centre of their operations, and even today, New York's I guess it's the mecca of show business, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that what you say?
I have another question too. Do you know how the circus evolved and when it got started? I mean, any circus? the circus? Not theirs, I mean, just
Well,
the circus in general.
yeah, well, one thing to be certain about is that the circus of the modern era is not the same as the Roman circus.
No.
There's no like the Roman circus was gladiators and people killing each other and all this sort of thing. But the circus as we know it today, in a general sense, that took off in London when a guy called Philip Astley, he was a former cavalry rider in the British Army, he got the idea of presenting trick horses on a field at Lambeth in London. London being not so built up as it is today. And from that he then put a roof over the things and put grandstands and stuff like this. And but he never called it a circus, he always called it Astley's Amphitheatre. But in the slang of London, it became known as a circus because in London and in other British cities, the wealthy aristocratic riders, they used to have riding tracks in the large parks, circular riding tracks, which were called circuses, after the Latin word for a circle. So people just said, well, these horses are going around in Astley's Amphitheatre, so we'll just call it a circus. So eventually the name stuck, and by 1793 you had circus entertainments. George Washington was one of the patrons of America's first circus. And of course then you go on to people like Barnum and Bailey and Ringlings and so on. So, and in Australia it took a longer time to take off because of a smaller population. And Australia started off as a convict colony, so convicts weren't allowed to have circuses. They had to go and dig the roads and stuff like that. But about 1847, the circus took off in Australia, but on a much smaller scale than here in America.
How did they get the horses there?
To Australia?
Yeah.
Oh, well, they were taken up by ship, first of all. The British sent all the supplies necessary for the convict colony, and Australia started breeding horses, and quite successfully, because after a while the British Army in India, they used to send their representatives down to Australia to buy Australian horses because they were so good for Indian conditions. Mm.
They always seem to have, or maybe it's because of the pictures, white horses, or is this?
Yeah, I think mostly, yes, because they somehow looked good for the ring. Yes, you're right. White horses were prized, but you do see other, chestnuts and.
Yes.
But certainly white horses. I think there's a particular breed called the Percheron, which is very suitable for circus work. See, circus horses, they need, for the performer to do their performance, they usually need to have a broad back to land on when they do their somersaults, and also they need to be very steady with their gait. You can't have a horse that goes a bit fast and a bit slow because that would upset the act. So it needs to be a very steady, reliable horse with a big back and trustworthy like that.
Thank you.
How did they get on the high wire act?
The high wire.
I mean, from a horse up to.
Oh, well, a lot of these circus performers, they were trained in a different range of skills. So there might be an acrobat in one part of the program, and there might be a wire walker in another part of the program. Sometimes they'd even put on a different costume and different makeup to make the audience think it's a completely different performer. But there's a lot of what do you call it? Leisure domain in circus, trying to sell it to the people.
It's very interesting that they could incorporate themselves into the vaudeville era, because that was so popular.
Yeah, well, that it's not so much the horse acts, because there's only very few theatres that can have horse acts, but acts like acrobatics, wire walkers, those sorts of acts you could easily take out of circus and put them in vaudeville. And that was good for the performer, because in America the circus really only operates from about March to about October, doesn't operate during the winter months. But if you have an act you can take into vaudeville, you can work vaudeville for those months, and you've got an income all around the year, and you can afford to buy a house on Long Island.
So, how long does this whole process take you? How many years, or? this whole research?
Well, I'm 71, and I started when I was just turning 17.
Was that a hobby of yours, or was it a full-time occupation? Research. Maybe both, huh?
Well, originally I was just curious, but although I didn't realise at the time, it was like something at Alice in Wonderland falling down the well or something, and there's no bottom to it. And 50 years, like I just showed you that letter I just turned up the other day, I'm still turning up stuff. I only had coffee this morning with some people whose great-grandparents had worked with my family in American circus, and we had a great exchange of conversation. So, but these days I'm sort of spend most of my time just cataloguing the research and putting it into order. So one day when I end up like Alfred, other people can use it and rely upon it. I've had several books published, and so I haven't made much money out of it, but it's given me a lot of pleasure, sometimes a lot of pain, but a lot of pleasure.
Are the books mentioned on your website?
Yes, they are.
Do you have any relatives that are, or children yourself, that are interested in continuing this?
No, it sounds funny, but regardless of all the work I'm doing, I'm not that interested in circus. It sounds ridiculous, but I'm more interested in the circus history. That's what fascinates me. And well, I have two daughters, and one daughter has two sons now. But the two daughters, well, I guess they're just marginally interested in this. They say, "Oh yes, Dad, yeah." I got better history.
Unfortunately, that's their family history.
Yeah,
So it's there.
Yeah.
It's there for
Well,
them.
you know, one day they might get to appreciate it.
Well, the Cirque Soleil is, I mean, after all, it's very famous.
Yeah.
Right, that Canadian.
Cirque Soleil.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
And I mean, they're putting on quite a show.
Yeah. Well, they come down to Australia regularly, and they have me on their complimentary list. So every time they come down, they send me tickets, and so.
That's
Yes,
nice.
it's very nice. There's no animals, of course.
No.
It's just human performance, and so.
That's great.
Are you also, this is maybe only related sort of at the sideline, are you also interested in the music that accompanied the circus acts? Because this is something that I think was always at least attractive to us. I remember when we went to the circus, the music alone was excitement.
Yeah, well, I was a trumpet player myself once upon a time, and I'd been inspired to do that because my grandfather had played trumpet in the family circus band. So I learnt music myself. But I was more interested in jazz really than. But I have made written some articles and on circus. In Australia, there's a musicologist. In Melbourne, I work closely with, and we've done a lot of research together on early circus music. No, there's some wonderful pieces of music written, and even Stravinsky wrote a piece for the circus. I don't know. It was for an elephant ballet that was presented in Ringling Circus in New York in 1943. But they commissioned Stravinsky to write this elephant ballet. I haven't got around to hearing it, but it's probably
It's
worth
a
it.
wonderful little museum down in Sarasota, Florida.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a
Yes.
wonderful thing
Yeah.
to go to.
Yes. When we walked in there, they happened to have this famous Barnum and Bailey music,
Mm.
and it just transformed.
Oh, the circus bands were fabulous.
Yeah.
Yes, years ago I met Merle Evans, who had been the Ringling bandmaster. I met him when I was down there in Sarasota and retired. Well, the thing in circus in those days, you had to have a number of skills, and often the performers, they could play musical instruments. So when they weren't performing in the ring, they could dash around, change their costume, go and join the band and start playing the trumpet or the trombone or something.
Well, thank you. It was very nice.
Yes.
It's a really nice display. I think it was in the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. that had a beautiful collection of huge circus posters, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. Yeah, there's several around the country, but the biggest collection is with the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Modern Art. They've got the Tibbles collection. It's absolutely
It's incredible.
incredible.
Where is this?
Sorry?
Where is this?
Sarasota, the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art. You'll see them on the website. You can call up many of the posters on the website.
Yeah.
But no, the American circus posters are absolutely out of this world. The old ones, real works of art.
They're great. Well, thank you. Any other questions? No. Good. Really transported us back to circus we remembered as children, right? And music, just thinking of the music, you can remember it. But that's a great history. And I was curious as to why he was buried here since he died not in New York.
In Massachusetts,
Massachusetts,
yeah.
right.
Well,
And then but
that would have
his
been
family
a
would
job
have
to
been
get it down
here.
in the casket. And
Yeah, his
buried.
family would have been here. I don't
Yeah,
know if we
so-
looked to see where they lived. We might have some record.
Yeah, they might.
Might have lived maybe in Brooklyn or something, close to
Yeah,
close to Coney Island. It's a great time.
It's an interesting.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you for coming along.
And how they must have traveled back then. I mean, to go from, say, Vancouver, San Francisco, let alone crossing the Pacific, but, you know, coming here with young children, and
Yeah.
having babies along the way, and then coming across the country. And you see it with other families too. This is tremendous. Tremendous accomplishment. And beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
That's
very
really
nice.
nice.
Okay.
Very different.
Oh, nice.
Very different.